You can do everything society tells you to do, follow every responsible rule, avoid obvious mistakes, and still feel stuck financially, year after year, wondering why stability never turns into real progress. That quiet frustration is not a personal failure. It is the result of a system of habits that looks correct on the surface, yet rarely builds long-term leverage. Many people don't lose money by being reckless, they lose it by being perfectly reasonable. Hello, I'm Max, and if this content helps you better understand how money works in real life, I invite you to leave a like and subscribe. Here, we explore finances calmly and with perspective, focusing on how everyday decisions shape outcomes over time rather than chasing shortcuts or extremes. Doing everything right usually means following a familiar script. You get an education, find stable work, pay your bills on time, avoid debt when possible, and try not to overspend. On paper, this looks like financial maturity. In reality, it often creates a form of quiet stagnation, where money flows in and out efficiently but never accumulates enough momentum to change your trajectory. The system keeps running, yet nothing truly compounds. One reason this happens is that doing things right often prioritizes safety over growth. Stability becomes the goal, rather than optionality. Income is used primarily to maintain a lifestyle, not to expand future flexibility. Savings may exist, but they are frequently treated as insurance rather than as a tool for building leverage. Over time, this mindset produces a life that is financially tidy, but structurally fragile. Consider a common example. Two people earn similar incomes, live responsibly, and avoid obvious financial mistakes. The first person directs surplus income toward maintaining comfort, upgrading conveniences, and smoothing daily life. The second person, while equally responsible, allocates a portion of that surplus toward long-term investments, skill development, or opportunities that may not pay off immediately. For years, their lives look nearly identical. The difference only becomes visible much later, when one has flexibility and options, while the other has stability without momentum. Another hidden issue is that many correct financial behaviors are reactive rather than strategic. Paying bills on time is necessary, but it does not create growth. Avoiding debt reduces risk, but it does not automatically build opportunity. Budgeting controls damage, yet rarely generates upside on its own. These habits protect the present, but they do little to shape the future unless paired with long-term intent. Comfort also plays a subtle role. When life is manageable, there is little pressure to think beyond the current system. The bills are paid, the routine works, and discomfort is minimized. However, comfort often delays strategic thinking. It creates the illusion that progress is happening simply because nothing is going wrong. Over time, this leads to a slow erosion of potential, not through bad decisions, but through the absence of decisive ones. Psychologically, doing everything right can also discourage questioning. If the rules are being followed and the outcomes are acceptable, dissatisfaction feels unjustified. This suppresses curiosity and prevents experimentation. People remain loyal to systems that no longer serve them, simply because those systems once provided security. The cost of this loyalty is rarely obvious until years have passed. There is also a timing problem embedded in responsible behavior. Many correct decisions are optimized for short-term reassurance rather than long-term impact. Choosing certainty over scalability feels wise, yet it often caps upside. The irony is that risk is not eliminated, it is simply shifted into the future, where missed opportunities become far more expensive than early uncertainty ever was. Over time, this pattern creates a quiet divide. Some people move from stability to leverage, from income to assets, from routine to optionality. Others remain responsible, disciplined, and permanently constrained, not because they failed, but because they never moved beyond what felt correct. This is where the real distinction begins. Wealth is rarely built by doing everything right in the conventional sense. It is built by understanding which rules protect you, and which ones quietly limit you. The difference is subtle, uncomfortable, and often invisible at first, but it defines who eventually breaks free from financial repetition and who remains stuck inside it. The problem with doing everything right is not that the actions themselves are wrong, but that they are often incomplete. They are designed to prevent failure, not to create meaningful progress. Over time, this distinction becomes critical, because avoiding mistakes does not automatically produce forward momentum. Stability and growth are not the same thing, even though they are often treated as interchangeable. Many people operate within a narrow definition of success. As long as expenses are covered, savings exist, and nothing feels out of control, the system appears to work. Yet this system is usually optimized for maintenance, not expansion. Money circulates efficiently, but it does not multiply. Income replaces income, bills replace bills, and years pass with very little structural change. The routine is functional, but it lacks leverage. A common example appears in how surplus income is treated. When extra money arrives, whether through raises, bonuses, or side work, the default response is often to improve comfort. Slightly better housing, more convenience, upgraded services, or smoother daily life. Each upgrade feels deserved and justified, especially after years of responsible behavior. However, these improvements rarely change long-term positioning. They increase dependence on consistent income while reducing flexibility. By contrast, individuals who eventually break out of this cycle treat surplus differently. Instead of asking how money can improve the present, they ask how it can strengthen the future. Funds are directed toward assets, skills, or opportunities that do not provide immediate comfort but gradually increase optionality. The difference is subtle in the early years, yet decisive over time. Another area where doing things right quietly fails is risk perception. Responsible behavior often encourages minimizing uncertainty at all costs. Stable jobs, predictable routines, and guaranteed outcomes are favored, while anything uncertain is avoided. This feels sensible, yet it often leads to a hidden trade-off: reduced upside. Risk is not eliminated, it is delayed. Missed opportunities accumulate silently, and their cost becomes visible only much later. Consider two people with similar careers. One prioritizes certainty above all else, staying within familiar boundaries and avoiding discomfort. The other accepts measured uncertainty, investing time and resources into skills or projects with delayed rewards. In the short term, the cautious path feels safer. In the long term, it often produces a ceiling that cannot be crossed without disruption. The individual who embraced uncertainty gradually builds options, while the cautious one remains dependent on a single system. Time is another overlooked factor. Doing everything right often consumes all available energy maintaining the present. Work, responsibilities, and routines leave little space for exploration or long-term planning. Growth activities are postponed, not because they are unimportant, but because they are not urgent. Over time, this creates a pattern where effort is expended continuously, yet progress remains limited. There is also a psychological comfort in correctness. Following established rules reduces anxiety and provides social validation. When behavior aligns with accepted norms, it feels safe. Questioning those norms, however, introduces discomfort and doubt. As a result, many people remain loyal to strategies that once worked, even when circumstances have changed. The cost of this loyalty is rarely immediate, but it compounds quietly. Importantly, none of this implies recklessness or irresponsibility. The issue is not that discipline, budgeting, or stability are harmful. The issue is that they are often treated as final goals rather than foundations. Without an additional layer of long-term intent, these habits become a holding pattern instead of a launch pad. Over years, this dynamic creates a divide that is difficult to explain on the surface. Two individuals may appear equally disciplined, equally intelligent, and equally hardworking, yet their outcomes diverge dramatically. One slowly accumulates assets, flexibility, and control. The other remains financially correct, yet increasingly constrained. The difference lies not in effort, but in orientation. Doing everything right protects you from falling backward. It does not guarantee that you will move forward. Understanding this distinction is uncomfortable, because it challenges the belief that responsibility alone is enough. Yet it is also empowering, because it reveals that stagnation is not a personal failure, but a structural one. This realization marks a turning point. Once it becomes clear that correctness is only the starting point, not the destination, the focus begins to shift. The question is no longer how to avoid mistakes, but how to build leverage that compounds over time. And that shift changes everything. One of the most misleading aspects of doing everything right is that the habits involved rarely feel dangerous. They feel sensible, controlled, and socially approved. This is precisely why they are so effective at keeping people financially stuck. The damage is not immediate, dramatic, or obvious. Instead, it unfolds slowly, disguised as responsibility and common sense. Take the habit of optimizing for monthly comfort. Many people focus intensely on keeping their monthly expenses perfectly balanced with their income. Bills are paid on time, subscriptions are justified, and any remaining surplus is used to make life smoother and more enjoyable. On the surface, this appears disciplined. In practice, it often locks individuals into a cycle where income is constantly required to sustain the system. There is no excess pressure to rethink the structure, because everything appears to be working. This mindset creates a fragile equilibrium. As long as income continues uninterrupted, life feels stable. However, the system lacks depth. There is little margin for change, experimentation, or opportunity. When unexpected shifts occur, whether professional, economic, or personal, the absence of accumulated leverage becomes clear. The habits were correct, but they were optimized for continuity, not growth. Another right habit that quietly limits progress is the prioritization of certainty over scalability. Choosing predictable outcomes feels responsible, especially in environments that reward stability. Yet predictable outcomes often come with capped upside. Over time, this cap becomes a ceiling. Individuals remain productive, disciplined, and reliable, but their financial trajectory flattens. The system does not break, it simply stops expanding. This pattern is reinforced by how effort is rewarded. Many people equate hard work with progress, assuming that consistency alone will eventually lead to financial freedom. In reality, effort without leverage often results in exhaustion rather than expansion. Working harder inside a limited structure does not change the structure itself. Without intentional allocation toward assets or skills that scale over time, effort becomes a maintenance activity rather than a growth engine. Spending behavior also reflects this dynamic. Responsible spending focuses on justification rather than impact. Purchases are evaluated based on affordability, not long-term effect. If something fits within the budget, it is considered acceptable. Over years, this leads to a series of reasonable decisions that collectively consume resources which could have been used to build optionality. Nothing feels excessive, yet opportunity quietly slips away. Time management follows a similar pattern. Days are filled with obligations, routines, and tasks that keep life running smoothly. Activities that do not provide immediate results are postponed indefinitely. Learning, experimenting, or building something with delayed payoff feels risky when the present already demands so much attention. As a result, time is spent maintaining stability rather than investing in future flexibility. Social reinforcement strengthens these habits. Being responsible, reliable, and risk-averse is praised. Questioning established paths or prioritizing long-term leverage can appear unnecessary or even irresponsible. Over time, external validation discourages deviation from the norm, even when the norm produces average outcomes. Comfort grows, curiosity shrinks, and ambition is reframed as contentment. There is also a psychological cost to doing everything right. When progress stalls, frustration builds quietly. Yet because the behavior aligns with accepted standards, dissatisfaction feels unjustified. People internalize the stagnation as a personal shortcoming rather than recognizing a structural limitation. This self-blame further reduces the likelihood of change. Importantly, these habits do not fail because they are careless. They fail because they are incomplete. They protect against downside, but they do not intentionally create upside. Over time, this imbalance becomes decisive. Individuals who remain focused on correctness stay afloat, while those who complement discipline with long-term leverage gradually pull ahead. the separation does not happen overnight. For years, the outcomes look similar. The difference becomes visible only later, when one path offers flexibility, choice, and resilience, while the other requires constant effort just to maintain position. At that point, the realization is often uncomfortable. Everything was done right, yet the result feels limiting. Understanding this shift reframes the problem entirely. The issue is no longer effort or discipline, but direction. Once it becomes clear that responsibility alone is insufficient, the focus begins to move toward structure, leverage, and intentional long-term alignment. That shift is subtle, but it marks the beginning of real financial progress. The moment people begin to move beyond simply doing everything right, the change rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no sudden leap, no radical behavior, and no visible rejection of responsibility. The shift happens internally first, as priorities are quietly rearranged. Stability remains important, but it is no longer treated as the final destination. Instead, it becomes a platform from which long-term control and flexibility can be built. One of the most significant psychological differences lies in how uncertainty is interpreted. Those who remain trapped in correctness view uncertainty as something to be minimized at all costs. Any deviation from predictability feels risky, even when the downside is limited. In contrast, individuals who build lasting financial momentum learn to distinguish between destructive risk and constructive uncertainty. They accept temporary discomfort or ambiguity when it increases long-term optionality. This distinction changes decision-making at a fundamental level. Choices are no longer evaluated solely by their immediate outcome, but by how they reshape future possibilities. A decision that slightly reduces comfort today may be preferred if it expands freedom tomorrow. This is not about chasing volatility or reckless behavior, but about understanding trade-offs across time rather than moments. Control becomes another defining theme. Doing everything right often creates the illusion of control through routine and predictability. Bills are managed, schedules are stable, and outcomes are familiar. However, this form of control is fragile because it depends heavily on continuity. True control, by contrast, is structural. It comes from diversified income streams, accumulated skills, and assets that continue working regardless of short-term conditions. As this perspective develops, time is reevaluated. Instead of being fully consumed by maintenance, portions of time are deliberately reserved for activities that do not produce immediate results. Learning, building, experimenting, and reflecting become non-negotiable components of the routine. While these efforts may appear inefficient in the short term, they gradually reshape the individual's financial architecture. Another quiet shift occurs in how success is measured. External validation becomes less influential. Comparisons lose their power. Progress is no longer judged by visible upgrades or social approval, but by internal metrics such as flexibility, resilience, and the ability to say no. This internalization of success reduces pressure to perform financially for others and increases alignment with long-term goals. Importantly, this transition does not eliminate responsibility. Discipline, budgeting, and consistency remain essential. What changes is their role. They are no longer the endpoint, but the foundation. Responsibility protects the downside, while intentional leverage creates upside. Without both, progress remains limited. Emotional regulation also improves. Individuals who think long-term develop greater tolerance for delayed results. They are less reactive to short-term setbacks and less euphoric about temporary wins. This emotional stability reinforces consistency, allowing decisions to compound rather than reset with every fluctuation. Over time, the cumulative effect of these shifts becomes visible. Financial decisions feel less stressful. Opportunities are evaluated more calmly. The future feels less fragile, not because risk has disappeared, but because the individual is no longer dependent on a single outcome. Flexibility replaces rigidity, and strategy replaces reaction. What makes this transformation difficult is that it often lacks immediate rewards. There are no quick signals that confirm progress. The benefits emerge slowly, almost invisibly. This is why many people abandon the process prematurely, returning to the comfort of correctness. Yet those who persist begin to experience a different relationship with money, time, and effort. By the time the results become obvious, the gap has already formed. The individual who once appeared merely responsible now possesses options that others do not. Choices expand, pressure decreases, and the quiet realization emerges that wealth, in its most practical form, is not about excess, but about control. This is the stage where the difference between doing everything right and doing things intentionally becomes unmistakable. The rules have not been broken. They have been reinterpreted. Responsibility remains, but it is now guided by long-term vision rather than short-term reassurance. Over time, the difference between those who remain financially constrained and those who quietly move ahead becomes difficult to ignore. It does not appear as a dramatic breakthrough, nor does it arrive with a single defining moment. Instead, it shows up as calm confidence, flexibility, and the absence of constant pressure. What once looked like ordinary responsibility slowly transforms into a deeper form of control. Those who moved beyond doing everything right did not abandon discipline. They refined it. Their decisions became less about maintaining balance and more about shaping direction. Money was no longer treated only as something to manage, but as a tool to expand future choices. This subtle shift changed how opportunities were evaluated and how risk was perceived. As years pass, the results begin to compound in ways that feel almost unfair to those still following the original script. One path requires continuous effort just to stay in place. The other allows progress to continue even when attention shifts elsewhere. The gap widens quietly, without announcements or validation, until it becomes structural rather than situational. What makes this realization uncomfortable is how ordinary the solution appears in hindsight. There was no secret strategy, no dramatic sacrifice, and no rejection of responsibility. The difference was orientation. One group optimized for correctness and comfort, the other optimized for leverage and time. In the end, wealth is not built by avoiding mistakes alone. It is built by understanding which rules are protective, and which ones must be transcended. Doing everything right keeps life stable. Thinking long-term, and acting intentionally, is what allows it to expand.